speakers. Today we have the last invited speaker sessions. First of all, I would like to thank all of our privileged professors here just accept to be here with us, with our conference and with our participants. I am Dr. Şuay Nilhan Açıkalın. I am Vice President of International Science Association, who is founder of this conference series, and I am currently working on the cause complexity in international relations. I don't want to take much more time. Professor Marcus Holmes won't be with us today. I would like to show his video at the end of the session. He just uploaded a video for us, but first I would like to give floor to the Professor Tome to make his speech, and then we will continue with our guests.
Should I start? I am the first? Okay, let me try to share my PowerPoint before I start talking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is an honor to participate in this conference in a panel shared by you and with such distinguished speakers. Major crises have major consequences, usually unforeseen. COVID-19 has installed a crisis, which by definition means disorder in the existing order. And in addition to the pandemic crisis, we have to add its devastating economic, social, and political impacts, whose effects are even more difficult to foresee. It is too early to draw definite conclusions about the impacts of this crisis, but it seems clear to me that pandemic crisis has underlined and accelerated backward trends and has triggered dynamics that could redefine world geopolitics and the international order. It is my purpose here to highlight some of these impacts. Data show that some countries and regions have been more successful than others in managing the pandemic. It also shows that success or failure in responding to the pandemic is not a matter of political regime. Some liberal democracies have performed well, but others are showing catastrophic results, and the same is true for autocracies. However, nationalism, populism, and the attacks on the liberal international order, which have been growing for years, have had in this crisis a new instrumental pretext to try to advance their agendas. And this is in spite of the failure to manage the pandemic of national populist leaders such as Trump in the US, Modi in India, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. In fact, in general, rather than cooperate constructively for their common benefit and promoting collective efforts in the face of a global crisis, countries turned to themselves, sought national responses, preached against each other, and often made rival scapegoats for their own failures. This climate is conducive to the spread of the virus of populism and nationalism, which will also try to take advantage of the economic and social crisis associated with the pandemic crisis. The national selfishness underlined by the pandemic also feeds another previous trend, the weakening of multilateralism. Attacks on the World Health Organization are the best example of this, in a context which would precisely advise international cooperation and support of the main international institution with responsibilities for global pandemic coordination and management. But not only that, many other international institutions have been paralyzed by the self-confinement of their member states, entangled in the national management of the pandemic, as if multilateral bodies no longer have relevance in this and all the other areas of international society. Similarly, countries seem to forget the others, and also the many other issues requiring international attention and cooperation, from climate change to migration management. In particular, despite persistent appeals such as those of the UN Secretary General or Pope Francis, The pandemic has forgotten the many violent conflicts from Syria to Nagorno-Karabakh that have continued to take place, and also the populations most in need of international aid. The national responses to the pandemic have also been dominant in the European Union. The member states did not act in concert or in solidarity when COVID-19 broke out in Europe, but unilaterally closing borders, suspending free movement, stipulating their own measures, buying protective materials, and so on an each for himself basis and without coordination. After the sovereign debt crisis, the migrant crisis, and the Brexit crisis, the pandemic crisis once again highlighted the lack of union of the EU. In connection with this, the EU saw its power of attraction and leadership by example undermined and was again unable to lead or be a decisive voice in the global management of the pandemic. That is, missing an excellent opportunity to assert itself as a relevant international player and a global power pole in the absence of the US. Moreover, the EU now also has to deal with the threat from the UK, failure to comply with the Brexit agreement, and the stronger pressures from a less reliable US and a more assertive China. In what concerns the US, its highly polarized society and incompetent President Trump prevented the superpower from functioning effectively against COVID-19, having judged that his political fortunes were best served by the devaluation of the pandemic and the discrediting of scientists, and on the other hand, by confrontation rather than national unity. President Trump has used this crisis to pick fights and increase social cleavages. The West's terrific performance facing the pandemic has several causes, but perhaps the most significant has been President Trump's inability to lead. And to the tragedy caused by the pandemic must be added the biggest fall in US GDP and employment rate in many decades. The same incompetence happened in the US foreign policy. COVID-19 highlighted the Trump administration's lack of ability to lead the world in a global crisis, as well to articulate with allies and partners, persisting in the protectionist, populist, and nationalist rhetoric of America first. At the same time, Trump escalated and instrumentalized China's demonization to deflect criticism and once again attacked the international institutions, in particular the WHO, rather than galvanizing them. This stance may be due to a certain hegemonic fatigue or to a cyclical American isolationism or strategic retreat. But the Trump brand is unquestionable, subverting and limiting collective and more concerted efforts. Taken together, these factors result in a new question of the US position and role in the international system. On the other hand, the pandemic crisis hit the US in the middle of the presidential elections campaign, largely conditioning the stance of both President Trump and his political opponents, including Joe Biden. And the truth is that China's perception as the major strategic rival and major threat has become relatively consensual in the US, with relationship with China being the main and almost exclusive foreign policy topic of Trump and Biden's presidential campaigns. As for China, besides being the birthplace of the new coronavirus, at an early stage, the regime's attempts to conceal data and silence scientists and doctors, as well as the country's factory of the world difficulties in producing and supplying fans and protective materials, have called into question the leading role of the Chinese Communist Party and China's international position. But with the vigorous measures it has put in place, Beijing began to control the pandemic while it spread in other countries and regions, notably Europe and then the US. As if in a boomerang effect, the global expansion of COVID-19 was quickly exploited by Beijing to try to position China as a reference in pandemic management, promoting its own system, lessons learned and measures, providing aid and protective materials to other countries from Asia Pacific to Latin America, Europe, or Africa, and resuming large-scale production and export of protective and health materials to the entire globe. But more relevant, in the midst of the pandemic crisis, China has shown unusual assertiveness, seeming to abandon the principle of keeping a low profile and of a peaceful coexistence, and essentially non-confrontational. In fact, from the intensification of repopulation and militarization in the South China Sea to the national security law imposed on Hong Kong, through military confrontation with India for the first time in decades and successive diplomatic frictions and threats of sanctions against various countries, from Australia to Canada, Beijing made a great leap forward in realization of the Chinese dream and the affirmation of China's claims. This assertiveness is largely inherent to the autocratic accelerated Xi Jinping regime, and is also the result of a self-confidence in the face of the growth of China's all-encompassing national power, the perceived decline of the US, and the attempt to take advantage of the opportunities created by the unpredictable Trump administration and international fractures. However, Beijing may be going too far and too fast, risking provoking a real anti-China front. Indeed, for many countries and political leaders, including in Europe, this crisis has helped to change the perspective on China from a benign giant panda from whose growth everyone can benefit to the threatening dragon that resurgent China also represents. In essence, the pandemic crisis may help assert China as an emerging superpower, but it may also bring the costs inherent in that condition. In a world power structure in transition, which we can characterize as uni bi multipolar, this crisis has reinforced the perception of bipolarity between the apparently declining and emerging superpowers. In times of crisis, global rivalries tend to intensify rather than abate, and the pandemic crisis seems to confirm this sentence. COVID-19 is not a cause of competition between the US and China, but has exacerbated tensions and frictions that existed for years, from trade disputes to the Taiwan question, human rights, South China Sea, technology, and so on, in a context aggravated by both Chinese assertiveness and the US presidential elections campaign. The global distribution of power will probably continue to shift eastward, since East Asia has done better at managing the pandemic situation than Europe or the US. The negative economic fallout from the pandemic at the developed economies of Europe and the US may be more profound and long-lasting than in Asia-Pacific economies. The pandemic is therefore likely to accelerate the delocation of global economic power from the West to the East. Estimates point to a less sharp fall in GDP and a faster recovery, both in Asia Pacific compared to other regions and China compared to all other major economies in the world. If confirmed, these projections, this means that the centrality of Asia Pacific in the world economy will strengthen, and in parallel, that China could emerge from the pandemic and economic double crisis with the world's highest GDP in real terms, having already outpaced the US GDP in purchasing power parities, with the inherent consequences for all other power dimensions and limiting the scope for decoupling strategies of other countries vis-à-vis China. In other words, this crisis could also result in a more Sinocentric economic globalization. On the other hand, the pandemic has raised questions about hyperglobalization and dependence on certain international production and supply chains. faced with difficulties in supplying medical equipment and protective materials, many governments and countries now want to have strategic reserves so as not to depend, at least as much, on foreign supply, seeking to have a certain level of national production and also to diversify their suppliers. The pandemic and economic double crisis could also have important strategic implications, although some trends are ambivalent. For example, more than ever, pandemics have become a matter of national security by virtually all countries, which may favor the strengthening of defense budgets under this pretext. At the same time, however, the increase in health budgets and the additional resources needed to deal with the economic and social crisis may compromise or force certain programs, investments, and budgets previously planned in the field of security and defense to be readjusted. On the other hand, depending on the size and depth of the economic crisis and the speed of recovery, some states will be in a better position than others, or sooner, to increase their military capabilities and or invest in dual-use technologies. This type of readjustments may lead to changes in the situation and strategic balances between powers and in certain regions, as well as calling into question certain previous commitments. For example, within NATO, to earmark 2% of GDP for defense by 2024, which many of the European allies find very difficult to achieve, with unpredictable consequences. The effects of COVID-19 have produced many heated debates and scenarios on a hypothetical international new order, from a new Cold War to the end of globalization. The reality is that in the midst of a pandemic crisis, it is too early to see its full effects. Like any other crisis, it can have several outcomes, some worse than others. Restoring the status quo ante is very unlikely. But the order that will follow is absolutely uncertain. And uncertainty is, after all, another effect of any crisis. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Dear Professor Luis Tome, thanks for your presentation. Dear participants, you can write your questions on the chat box. We will take the questions after the whole presentation will be done. Professor Oktay Tanrısever, could you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hocam, floor is yours.
Okay. Am I now connected with the video?
Yes, we can see your video, hocam.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to thank, first of all, Şule Hoca and all organizers and your association, International Science Association, for organizing this very important conference and inviting me to participate in the 7th meeting. I think global pandemic is very important challenge for mankind, and associations like yours focus on very important aspect of that complexity and also chaotic nature of global change. And in my presentation, I'd like to focus on the energy sector, how the pandemic is related to global energy dynamics, what are the major challenges for mankind, and also what would be the appropriate measures to be taken for coping with these challenges. Of course, Professor Tome drew very good picture of global geopolitical aspect, and we learned a lot about the future dynamics of world system. and the tension between the Chinese and the US global leadership dynamics, I think will shape this geopolitics, and we will see how different factors related to that will affect global geopolitics. But when we look at our specific sector, energy sector, I think this is also closely linked to the geopolitical issues because the nature of Chinese economy and European economy and global economy in general is premised on certain globally supported energy policies. And this pandemic informed us that it is very important to achieve energy transition from high carbon economy to low carbon economy. On that, we see a global consensus, with the exception of certain countries. Turkey and United States and few other countries had some reservations about the Paris Treaty on climate change, while many others supported this, and United States had withdrawn from this agreement because of its economic impact. And Turkey, although Turkey supports the energy transition, Turkey also had its own reservations about the possible economic impact of this agreement. But when we look at the global picture, there seems to be a consensus on moving towards a low carbon economy, and the energy policies will play a critical role in that. During the pandemic, we realized that willingly or unwillingly, many countries reduced their carbon emission. And one of the good things about the restrictions was the low carbon emission, and many countries, mainly China, and also most of the southern European countries benefited from this low carbon emission. So many people realized the benefits of low carbon economy. Of course, we favored this because of its environmental advantages, but moving to low carbon economy is not as easy as one might speculate, because its economic costs are huge, and countries adopted these policies not voluntarily but because of the need to deal with the pandemic. So the reservations of countries like United States, Turkey, and few others are still there. How can we achieve this low carbon economy without hurting economies? So this is really an important challenge for mankind. And in the aftermath of this crisis, pandemic crisis, it's not still certain whether China and EU will maintain their consensus over the Paris Agreement, because as Professor Tome mentioned, there are also some criticisms leveled against China for its handling of the crisis and the cooperation with the EU and the West in general. So what we see at the moment is a more chaotic environment. So global chaos over pandemic, I think, resulted in some major question marks about the sustainability of energy transition to low carbon economy because of this global geopolitical rivalries. But when we look at the real energy consumption levels, still we are at a very good level, and because more and more countries try to make efficient use of their energy resources. And energy prices are still low because of low demand for energy. And this is likely to remain so for the at least 2 years to come. This means that international community has a golden opportunity to upgrade their economies to fit low carbon futures. This is really a big challenge, but it is doable because at present opportunities for relying on fossil fuels are limited. Many countries come up with new technologies, and Turkey being one of them, it will produce its first national brand automobile car on electricity, fully electricity powered car will be operational or will be on market soon. And many European countries and also Asian companies will also increase the number of electricity powered cars or hybrid cars. So this will diminish demand for fuel oil or oil. So this is one of the main reasons for pollution, global pollution, air pollution, and also carbon emission. I think that kind of introduction of new technologies will create new opportunities. Another important opportunity for transition to low carbon economy is related to digitalization. I think the pandemic has another good advantage for global economy for making digitalization key issue, because face-to-face interaction became risky for health reasons, and more and more processes related to energy sector have become more digitalized, and it reduced cost. And this kind of technological innovation, I think, is likely to encourage the use of electricity, and the electricity networks could be enhanced technologically so that more effective use of electricity could be enhanced. This will, I think, create also some risks because of too much dependence on cyberspace. I think makes these systems more vulnerable to certain unauthorized activities or cybercrime, cyber terrorism, and any form of illegal activity in the cyberspace. And the energy sector seems to be one of the targets of such groups. And I think this is a very important challenge. But the advantages of digitalization are much greater than the disadvantages of the risks of cyber insecurity. I believe digitalization will move forward. So this will, I think, the global increase in the use of electricity globally in more sectors, including transportation, and also enhanced efficiency of electricity distribution networks will make it easier for renewable energy to have more possibilities of use, and the systems will be modernized internationally, and the renewable energy producers will have access to international markets through this integration, regional integration of energy markets. This is also happening in Europe, and Turkey is also joining this European electricity network. The future form of energy, which is more environment friendly and low carbon emission is possible only through renewable energy. And I think developments in solar energy technology and also wind energy make it very easy for many countries to produce electricity as cheaply as possible compared to electricity from coal and natural gas, which are relatively more expensive or environment unfriendly. So I think now we have new window of opportunity, but there are also some difficulties. So the main difficulty, I think, is related to existing infrastructures. Existing infrastructures in many countries, including developed countries, needs more investment. So countries need to spend more money on their electricity infrastructures. This is important not only for making more use of renewable energy possible, but also for energy efficiency. Because most of the energy produced by either fossil fuels or renewable energy is lost during transmission because of poor infrastructure, electricity infrastructures, and many countries delay investment in the sector. But I think one of the key solutions to energy problems lies in energy efficiency. This requires some investment. This is important, but eventually, I think it would be easier for regional energy markets to achieve low carbon economy, because this is possible only with the relatively more production of renewable energy or electricity and decreased use of fossil fuels, mainly coal and natural gas. And also the electricity used in transportation will diminish demand for oil, another highly demanded fossil fuel. So eventually, I think this electricity revolution around the world is likely to make low carbon economy and more environment friendly energy policies possible. But as I said, this is easier said than done. More investment is needed. This is my conclusion, of course. This is the ultimate objective, the low carbon economy. But for this, I recommend that, or my conclusions include the following. First, those countries with some concerns over the transition to low carbon economy and also accession to Paris Treaty on climate change, these concerns need to be addressed. Turkey's concern is important because Turkey seeks to be part of that without being considered as an X1 group of countries. So it is not a big deal for the major countries to consider Turkey outside NX1, and the inclusion of Turkey will strengthen this climate change regime. This is the advantage. Another important thing is to include United States in the system again, because without United States, one of the key carbon emitters, the sustainability of this climate change regime of Paris Treaty will be at risk. So United States might be encouraged to join the treaty again. So having said all this, I would like to emphasize the importance of electricity, renewable energy in the use of electricity, and the greater use of electricity in many sectors, including transportation. I think there is a bright future for low carbon economy and more environment-friendly forms of energy use. Therefore, I'm hopeful about the future, and this pandemic created some risks, but also some opportunities. So we learned that we can survive without using too much fossil fuels, too much forms of hydrocarbons and coal. We can generate electricity with more technologically advanced systems, which produces more renewable energy, and digitalization and other forms of energy efficiency, I think, will all contribute to this challenge. Future, I think, requires, or the more, so the system is getting more complex and chaotic, that's for sure, but we can manage this complexity by using more technology and electricity-dependent forms of energy, and mainly renewable energy, which is the most environment-friendly one. So I would be happy to answer questions. Thank you for inviting me again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Oktay Tanrısever. Dear participants, once more, I would like to remind that if you have any questions, you can write on the chat box. Now, I would like to introduce Professor Daniela Irrera. Professor Daniela Irrera, could you hear me?
Yes, please, I'm here. Thanks.
Now the floor is for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you for inviting me, for organizing this wonderful conference, and I will join for the first time. But it's a great pleasure to share some views about these two keywords which are really intriguing to me: chaos and complexity, and how this pandemic condition is impacting the whole global system. Given that I'm a scholar focused on an international relations scholar, more focused on non-state actors, I would like to share with you some reflections on how the pandemic is producing an effect and an impact on the humanitarian system and on the most vulnerable categories, particularly refugees and migrants, and in the end, some general reflections on how the pandemic is also producing an impact on democratic systems, on the participation context more generally. And of course, it will be a very general set of reflections. And I will split into four main parts. Of course, when we talk about the humanitarian system, we go back to what Professor Tome said about the fact that because of the pandemic, we have just put the multilateral system has just put, conflicts aside, and effects of the pandemic can produce on the civilians, who are already torn and affected by conflicts, is to some extent underestimated. For sure, we see that COVID-19 outbreak is causing disruptions and instability everywhere in Europe, mainly, because it's our first, point of observation, but not only, of course, across the world. For sure, this is not the first pandemic that the world has experienced. However, what is shocking is that it's revealing this increasing and disconcerting unpreparedness at all levels. Although we can observe different performances in different regions, we see that both weaker and authoritarian countries, as well as wealthy and democratic ones, so those ones which are provided with, more stronger and more efficient health systems, all these countries are struggling to contain the effects of the virus, and mostly important now that we are facing the second wave, the so-called second wave, to prevent an economic disaster. And at the same time, we see that this COVID-19 outbreak is producing an impact on the ways through which all these countries have so far managed conflicts and crises. When it comes to humanitarian system, we can observe that the ways through which the current, the contemporary humanitarian system has developed and formed do not always address crisis responses in the common interest of societies at large, and not all the time, not all everywhere in accordance with humanitarian principles. And most importantly, and this is much more visible right now, it cannot prevent the marginalization of some groups. And this is particularly visible right now that we are facing the effect of the pandemic. So the humanitarian system was not able, even before, to face all aspects of conflicts and crises and proxy wars. And what we see is particularly the intervention of non-state actors, so civil society organizations and NGOs, trying to fill the gap which was left by states and also international organizations. So despite good intentions and also the repeated commitments to be more accountable and to be more share decision-making, inactivity is prevailing. And we see that everywhere in all conflicts, even the most, let's say the most recent one in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is actually considered and perceived as a frozen conflict, which from time to time it reappears and he reveals its violence again. Once again, we see everywhere inactivity or the lack of real responses. So we can say from this point of view that COVID-19 has reminded to the world that powerful Western countries are not only just as vulnerable to disasters as any other country, but they are most of the time ill-equipped and incompetent in dealing with them. And we see, of course, this most visible as for the European countries and the European Union in facing not only the health emergency, the most striking effects of the health emergency, and only the economic aspects of the crisis, which are becoming now very difficult to handle, but particularly when it comes to the way through which vulnerable people are assisted. This is a complete disaster. So from a point of view, once again, from the point of view of states, this is a complete failure. And we see rather more NGOs, international and local NGOs, more active in trying to fill that gap. So when it comes to vulnerable people, so this is a huge category, first of all. As the global reach of the COVID-19 outbreak was becoming more evident in March, the whole humanitarian system was trying to figure out which measure could be properly adopted to mitigate the effects on the most vulnerable places of the world, which are, of course, refugee camps to countries already experiencing poverty and deprivation, and including those countries countries already torn by civil conflicts. So these people were already marginalized, and they were noticeably most impacted by the crisis. This can be explained not only by their limited capacities to cope with the emergency, but also with the lack of civil rights and the exclusion from public spaces in many, many countries in which local interests and needs are discussed and negotiated. This happened in many regions of the world. So the need to contain the virus and to reduce its effects have also imposed to all governments the adoption of emergency policies. The most devastating effects can be observed in these regions because in places like, once again, Syria, Yemen, many African countries, now in Nagorno-Karabakh, once again, for example, local population cannot be tested to the lack of access to hospitals and health facilities. So additionally, in these places, communities share small living spaces. So it's impossible to practice social distancing. In many African countries, household economies are based on long-standing traditions of community mobility and remittance networks, and this was impossible. And in several low-income countries, Latin America and Southeast Asia, restrictions on travel and mobility have worsened lack of democratic institutions, as well as a scarcity of local resources and very low levels of social protections. So, of course, we see these not only the effects of the pandemic on the one hand in places which were already affected by other problems, but on the other, we see the lack of capacities on the part of states, international and regional organizations to cope with these problems. And within this big category of vulnerable, I would like to stress a little bit something more about refugees and migrants, who has been the ones who suffered most, and they are still suffering quite a lot. So asylum seekers and refugees are suffering a lot, not only in Europe, of course, because it's once again, it is where we can observe the most striking experiences, but almost everywhere in the world. Just think about what is happening at the border of Mexico and the US. So there's thousands of people stuck there and waiting for nothing special, because they're waiting for an authorization they will never probably receive. So these cases, the refugees and migrants are a paradigmatic case of the lack of responses on the part of states. And it's interesting because it's an establishment of the Global Compact on Refugees, the pressure on the principle of asylum and the refugee regime more generally have been intensified significantly by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, I mean, if we look at official documents, or especially on the part of UN bodies and UN agencies, we see that the Global Compact on Refugees was several times stressed because of the effects of the pandemic, as well as constituting a direct threat to the lives of refugees, especially those living in camps and informal urban settlements. The virus is likely to divert scarce resources from other humanitarian programs. There were very few funds available for them, and these funds are now going to be diverted for the provision of shelter, food, under assistance, including legal guard for unaccompanied minors. We have many. I live in Sicily, so there are so many people now. Probably they are less because of the weather conditions, so the Mediterranean is no more easy to be managed. But since last month, there were still several people arriving almost every day or every week in the island. And many of them are unaccompanied minors. So the provision of this assistance is becoming arduous and drastically reduced. And even outside camps, like the one in Moira, for example, or Lesbos in the Greek islands. So, in the EU countries, living conditions for migrants are not good at all. I would say that they are rather significantly worsened. So almost everywhere, the dominant health emergency measures have diverted attention and funds So government policies, law enforcement, police actions have become gradually more unreceptive. And this has also affected masses of undocumented refugees who have decided to stay in Europe despite the hostile environment and who are stuck here because of the pandemic, and they continue to be stuck because of the second wave, let's say. So even more seriously, in terms of the principle of asylum, the COVID-19 has provided a plausible excuse for governments to close their borders and to exclude refugees. So what we can see now in several European countries, but also in the rest of the world, is that many NGOs, particularly local NGOs or many local organizations which have diverted their funds or their activities towards the new vulnerables, which are now migrants and refugees. So the old and new roles of NGOs in assisting refugees and migrants are absolutely important right now, and they should be discussed more and more. So the expansion of such tasks is currently due to the lack of state capabilities or the state willingness to produce more responses. And they are the main actors which are doing something in order to assist people, to assist, I would say, all categories of vulnerable people, but particularly towards the assistance to migrants and refugees. And I would like to conclude with the last point, which is the effect of pandemic on democracy and participation, because what we are doing in respect to conflicts, to crisis, to vulnerable people is also a reflection on what is happening on the quality of democracy, or rather on the worsening conditions of illiberal non-democratic countries. So the major concern I would like to stress is the cutback of public space. It can be quite banal to say that lockdown and imposition of social distancing have provoked the reduction of social activism, the interruption of any civil protest, although we're now trying to see several civil protests against lockdown, paradoxically, because of the effects of economic crisis. And more importantly, the decline of deliberative processes with many governmental parliamentary activities drastically reduced because of the pandemic. So in many parts of the world, restrictions have been used by authoritarian regimes to end dissident voices and to impose autocratic power, which is exactly and precisely what all democracy advocates had feared. So the arrest and persecution of journalists, or the boycott of newspapers in many countries like Belarus, the limitations to the access to social networks, and more importantly, the spread of disinformation, like data on the number of cases, real cases, the number of increasing performance of the COVID-19 is the most severe attacks civil society activists are suffering, together with violence and police brutality in some cases. Even in some democratic EU member states, like more recently Hungary or Poland, illiberal policies have been supported in the name of public health. So despite these difficulties, just to be positive, just to end with a positive message, we can say that on the one hand, we see all these issues, so the lack of willingness, the lack of capabilities on the part of states, the lack of responses on the part of international organizations, UN and EU. But on the other, we can also see some positive effects, because the pandemic has allowed NGOs and other civil society organizations to reinvent their roles, and also offered some unexpected opportunities for lobbying. So on the one hand, we have the cutback of public space, but on the other, because of the outbreak, these many organizations are trying to, tiringly, but with some difficulties, with lots of difficulties rather, but they are trying to open more space of legitimacy So paradoxically, it can be also happen that because of the COVID-19, public opportunities for public debate can be offered in which states and non-state actors may interact, because in this moment, states absolutely need non-state actors, and non-state actors are filling that gap which is left by states. So probably this can be a set of unintended consequences, which in the end can be a positive message. So thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Daniela Irrera, thank you for your speech. I received one question to your speech, actually, from one of our YouTube participants. They asked that how would you see the EU position related with the refugees and immigrants vis-a-vis the post-COVID era?
Shall I reply now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Just to be sure whether I have to wait or to go now. Yeah, of course. Well, even although I try to be quite positive and to offer positive messages in the end, I'm very pessimistic about any EU migration policy in the near future, because it was, of course, the pandemic has worsened all conditions and almost everything, and so no assistance was offered to migrants and refugees, and they also been, attacked because of they were accused of bringing the virus, while like exactly like in the past they were bringing terrorism in Europe. So I saw right now a lack of solidarity, which has already been manifested in the past. Although there are more efforts on the part of the current president of the EU Commission to try to bring more efforts to push for more activities on the part of member states, actually, I don't think that things will be so different after the post COVID-19, particularly because in the future we will have less funds, and so another struggle would be how to properly distribute the vaccine among all people. So that in that case, the vulnerable who is a real vulnerable. So these people are really vulnerable, but they've been left aside and offered very, very few assistance. So unless we have more activities on the part of NGOs and more assistance on the part of NGOs, I don't see lots of hope on the part of any EU solidarity, because member states have no solidarity at all right now.
Thank you, Professor Daniela. We don't have any questions right now. That's why also we have a problem with the Professor Marcus Holmes video. Probably we will post on YouTube later. All sessions will be finished. So who wants to watch it, they can watch on YouTube and our websites. When I'm closing the session, once more, I would like to thank Professor Luis Tome, Professor Daniela Irrera, Professor Oktay Tanrısever. You honored us with our conference, and both Professor Luis Tome and Professor Oktay Tanrısever had been with us for almost 7 years, and I hope we will see Professor Daniela Irrera in upcoming conferences like Professor Luis Tome and Oktay Tanrısever. And in my last words, I also want to express Professor Dr. Şule Erçetin, who is co-chairwoman of this symposium. She sent best wishes to both our privileged speakers and participants here, and she also thank you on behalf of the association as well. Thank you very much again to be here with us, and thank you for the participants.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much for inviting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ne oluyor?